Hello everyone. In our previous video, we introduced the concept on how to draw basic shapes and objects inside Animate. We left off exactly where you're looking at, so let me just go ahead and select these items, and by dragging a selection from here to the top all the way to the bottom, clicking and dragging and then hitting the delete key. Now you'll notice that on doing that I emptied my keyframe down on my layer 1. Now let's pay attention a little bit more to those keyframes. I also introduced the concept of keyframes on our previous lecture. And so as you know, keyframes are a point in time where something happens. A point in time where something happens. So with that in mind, what I want to do now is I want to create an object that I can place inside that specific layer. One important thing to remember in Animate is that any item that you want to animate, if you want to create an animation for an object, that object that will be animated needs to reside in its own layer. That means from lecture 1, if you recall, basically every item that you want to animate, you need to subdivide. So we talked about the example of an arm. So if you want to animate the hand separate from the forearm, separate from the upper arm, those three items should reside into their own separate layers. Now you can connect those layers eventually, but and this is something very similar to the concept of linking layers or parenting layers in After Effects, or actually anchoring layers in 3D programs. You can go ahead and utilize the same concepts here, but that means that every one of those items, each one of the items that will be animated, will be in its own layer. So with this in mind, let's go ahead and actually introduce a new concept. Couple of new concepts. The first thing is, because we want to create new layers for every item, what we want to do is make sure that we understand what these icons do. So first things first, if you want to rename a layer, and I strongly suggest that you rename your layers according to what you want to put in them. So if you, for example, had, let's say, a circle, let me go ahead and draw a circle here. I'm going to make it an object. So I'll click and drag that object. Let me switch to my arrow tool to select it and make sure that it is actually in object mode, and it wasn't. So let me go ahead and deselect that. Select the drawing tool, make sure that it is selected as you saw. Now I see it on with the blue outline. When I click and drag, now it will be an object. You'll notice that my keyframe has been filled out. And if I want to create it, I would, at this point, if this was the content of that layer, I would simply double click that label to highlight it, and then I would enter the word circle on that and hit the return key or the enter key on the PC. Now that allows me to rename the layers. I can create as many layers as I want by clicking on that little plus sign right here, and I just click twice. You'll notice that I have 3 layers now. And if I wanted to get organized, say for example these 2 layers belong to one object but layer 3 doesn't, I would create a folder. Now you'll notice that a folder appears to be like an empty layer, and it doesn't have to be on top. You can click it and drag it whatever you want within the stack of layers. So you'll notice that as I'm clicking on that folder layer and I click and drag it down, the little black line with the white dot on the left appears, indicating that I can place it wherever I want within the stack. So let's say I place it right underneath the layer 3. That's where my folder is going to go. Then I can simply click and drag each one of my layers into that layer folder. There you go. So now I have circle and layer 2 inside it. If I want to move circle below layer 2, I'll simply drag it underneath it. So you'll notice that there's flexibility on where I place those layers. Now, it doesn't mean that this is the end of that. I can always take the circle back out and put it outside of the folder if I need to. So I have options when I'm working with those with the particulars of layers in order to accommodate my workflow. Now, why is this important? Because as you can see, I only have 3 layers so far, and it almost looks like I'm running out of real estate down here. So imagine if you had a complicated set of drawings, or let's say you're animating a mechanical robot, or some kind of scene where you have a background of trees and then birds flying around and flowers moving. You would have a significant amount of layers, and so it is good to get organized onto what goes where and animating those things, and then simply collapsing those folders to save yourself some real estate space. It also allows you to lock, and by clicking on their lock, anything that's inside that folder, notice that when I click and drag on that object, I cannot do anything to it, and that is because that particular set of layers has been locked because I locked the folder. So if that was a background and I had completed all the drawings that I want to do in my background, then I can simply lock it, and then I won't have by accident the ability to click and drag and move things around in my background. So it gives me the ability to get very organized. It also allows you to turn the visibility off of objects within that particular layer. So if I turn that off, then I don't see them anymore. They're there, but I don't see them anymore. It also allows me to outline the items inside that particular layer. So creating outlines is very useful when you're working with twinning or when you're working in onion skinning. If you want to see where items reside within your drawing paths, you might want to make use of this outlining option. And that outline option basically it doesn't erase. I mean, it doesn't turn off the visibility of the object. It only gives you the outline of the object that you have on the stage. Turning that back on and making sure that those swatches are full indicates that you actually see the item. So this is a very handy set of tools that you have under the layers for the timeline. Let me go ahead and select, by the way, I'm going to create yet one more layer, and I'm going to go ahead and select those two layers, and I'm going to delete the folder and the layers. It's going to tell me, are you sure you want to delete everything? There are objects in there. And I'll say, yes, that's okay. I want to delete everything. Now, what I want to do at this point is I want to bring in objects by importing items from other software. So let's switch for just a second to Photoshop. You'll notice that in Photoshop, I have two files. I have this file, which is called bearwalk.psd, and that has a series of layers inside that particular file. And this is literally what the name says. It's basically a little walk cycle of a bear walking in place. Now, this one right here is just something I downloaded from 123RF, which is basically just free vectors, drawings, and things like that I can get from the web. So you can just go ahead and download something from the web when you want to practice. So I'm going to import these two files into Animate. So let me go ahead and switch back to Animate. And in order to import something into Animate, you have options. So the first thing that you can do is the shortcut to import anything into Animate is Control R or Command R on the Mac. If you don't remember the shortcuts, go to File, Import, and you'll notice that you have options to import items in specific ways into your particular, into whatever you're building. The topmost, which is Control R or Command R, is import to stage, meaning you will bring whatever item you are bringing in into the stage. Now, when you do that, the item is going to give you, it's going to ask you to select other options as you are importing, such as, do you want things to be coming into one single layer? Do you want them to become frames? Do you want them to become separate layers? Specifically on something like that Photoshop file that we saw a second ago, which had 13 layers in it, or 12 layers. You can also import directly to the library. Now, what is the library? Let me deselect this to exit it. The library is another panel that we have on the upper right-hand corner. A library is basically, it's a collection of items that you're bringing in from external items that you're bringing in from other software. So things that are, these items that you can import into the library, they include bitmaps. They include, and by bitmaps, I mean JPEGs, Photoshop files, PNG files, GIF files, all of those can be imported. You can also import audio files, and you can also import video files. So audio and video we will be talking about later on in class. But for now, what we're going to be doing is importing this Photoshop file in layers, and we're going to also import the other file that we saw in there that it looked like a drawing. So when you import those files, they will show up in the library, whether you import them directly to the library or if you import them into your stage. Now, importing them into the library just places them in the library, and they're there for you to use at any time, whenever you need them. Importing them into the stage brings them into the stage and into the library. So basically what you have is the item imported into the library, and then you have an instance, what we call an instance of that object that you imported into the library into your stage. An instance is basically a copy of the file into your stage. And it's not necessarily like a direct copy. It's actually, like the word says, it's an instance of that specific object into the stage. So if you make a change to the object in the library, it will be shown in its instance on the stage. So let's go ahead and import the Photoshop file first. So import to stage, and I am going to look for that file that is called Bear Walk. There it is. And I am going to open. Now when I click open, it's going to ask me for more options. It's going to tell me, okay, so you have what appears to be several layers in there. What do you want to do? So it tells me, do you want to import the bitmap with editable layer styles if you want to? Or do you want to make every layer, every one of those items like a flattened bitmap, almost like a JPEG? It's going to say, okay, go ahead and flatten them. I don't need it. I don't have any styles. So if you had styles, for example, drop shadows or glows or things like that, then you would choose this option here, if that is what you're looking for, if you want to maintain those. You can create a movie clip. We're going to talk about movie clips in our next class. So let's skip for that over this right now. Now it can tell you what you want to do with this object. You want the compression settings for it to be lossy or lossless. This refers to the compression format and the codec that is being used to that specific layer, to that specific image that is being brought in. In case you don't know what a codec is basically a way of compressing data that allows you to send data or manipulate data fairly fast between programs, or when you're packaging a file to, let's say you're creating a movie clip or you are creating an actual flattened file, so that your file size is not too big. So when you apply that compression, you're basically applying a compression setting when you create the file, and then a decompression setting when you actually view the file. That's why it is called codec. Co means compression, dec, decompression. And so you choose whether you want a lossy format for it or a lossless format. Lossless basically means you have the image exactly as it came in from the original file, meaning it's the exact same size. If you do lossy, you're losing a bit of quality, but you have a smaller file. You can go ahead and use what is being said in publish settings, which we will talk about in our next class, how to publish something, or you can reduce by percentage. So whether you want, almost like when you're creating a JPEG in Photoshop or a GIF file, you actually can say, okay, I want a certain amount of percentage of quality lost in order to reduce the size of my final file. And you can also click and calculate the size of the bitmap. When you do that, by clicking on this, it's telling you this file, if you import it as is 4.61K. If you go and you reduce this, to, let's say, to 20%, click on bitmap size, now it's half the size. So, but the quality of it will be a lot less. So for now, let me just go ahead and maintain this as public, whatever the publish settings are, which I don't know, but I'm assuming they're 90% because that's what I'm seeing here. And then down here is how this is going to affect our timeline. Whether we want to convert the layers from Photoshop, from the Photoshop file to animate layers. Now, if you are creating an interface for an app, for an app, or if you are creating something for a website, if you are creating a mock-up for a prototype, then you most likely would want to have the ability to get those layers into a program where you don't have to import every item separately, where you simply almost like move what you are creating from that program, say Photoshop, into an environment into which you can start coding, or into which you can start adding interactivity into it without a lot of mid work or a lot of production work. And so that's where you would choose, okay, so if I want this I just want my layers and I want everything as I left it in Photoshop, then you would choose animate layers. If you want everything that is coming into that particular, all those layers to be into one single animate layer, then you would click single animate layers, and then you would tell it how you want it to be within those within that particular layer. You can also import them as keyframes. So each one of the layers becomes a keyframe, and importing as keyframes becomes one single layer, and each one of the items would be a keyframe. So in this case, that's what we want. We want to import it as keyframes. Now, you can also import the entire thing flattened if you want to import the whole thing as one single file, but what would be visible would be the topmost, which is covering everything in our case, so we don't want that. You can place the objects in the original position, which by default, if we go back to Photoshop, is the 0, 0 mark. As you can see, remember the origin or the 0 point for anything in a computer is the upper left hand corner. This area here would be your 0 point. For the screen then, the 0 point would be this area here, the upper left hand corner. So let's go back to Animate again. So that's where I want it to go. And then you can resize the stage, which right now is 640 by 480, to the size of the canvas coming in from Photoshop. So we don't want that. We want to maintain the size of my canvas, although if I wanted to resize it, I could just simply say resize it, and it will just resize the stage for me. So I can go ahead and click Import and watch what happens. It creates a new layer called Bear PSD. Each one of the frames in that particular layer became a keyframe, and you'll notice that they all are black, which means they all have a piece of artwork inside them. And inside my library, I now have a folder which contains all of the different bitmap layers for each one of the layers inside my Photoshop file. So it organized everything into a nice, neat little folder, and then it brought everything in from my little bear walk cycle in Photoshop into a layer and placed all of those layers into keyframes. Now, over here, what I want to do now is I want to click on this loop option so that my animation loops. And then when I click the play button, you will notice that my animation is playing. But you will notice that it's only playing about 3 frames. And that is because by default, the program will only give you, let me pause that, it will only give you the animation available for whatever is covered by this blue outline. This blue line up here is almost like your work area in After Effects, or your animation area in, let's say, if you're working with Maya or something like that. It's basically the range of frames that you have available to see. So if you want to see more than that, go ahead and go to the edge of that blue line and extend it to where you want to by clicking on either this point or the other point over here. So let me move my playback head by simply dragging it, and I can move the beginning point as well. So it's fairly flexible. I'm gonna set it up so that it covers the entirety of the frames that I have, and you will notice that I can scrub my playback head. That blue line marks where in time I am within my timeline. And so I can go ahead and scrub downstream or upstream, as you can see, and I can see 1 frame at a time. I cannot go beyond that, and the reason for that is because I don't have any more frames out here. So if I had more frames down here, I would be able to scrub past this point. But since that's the last frame in my animation and in my timeline, then that's where it stops. So if I hit play now, watch what happens. My bear is walking backwards. So the frames were brought in exactly as I had them set up in Photoshop. If I want to reverse those frames, I can simply select all of the frames by clicking on the first one, selecting the first frame, go all the way to the last one and click on the last one, and you'll notice that things are selected when they get highlighted in blue, as you can see. And then you can right click and you can go ahead and say reverse frames out of the flyout menu. So if I do that, all of my frames have been reversed, and when I play my playback, my bear now walks forward. So it's working fairly fast. And the reason for that is because my animation, remember, let me click on the pasteboard area somewhere so that I have nothing selected. Go back to the properties so that I can see the properties for my movie, for what I am creating, and you'll notice that my FPS is 30 frames per second. Remember, 30 frames is the speed of playback. That means my animation is going to be taking 30 frames each second of animation. Right now, I only have 12 frames set up on this animation. So that means in less than half a second, I've already walked 2 steps, which is fairly fast. So if I wanted to see this at a more realistic speed, I can always do one of 2 things. I can either expand each one of these frames by 1 frame, meaning I am animating in 2s, or by 3 frames. I'm animating in 3s, depending on what your animating style is. And this is something you should have learned in your experimental animation class. Or you can switch your playback to lower. So let's say I'm going to go to 15 frames per second. Now that when I change my FPS to 15, I'll simply select that FPS number to highlight it, enter the number 15 and hit return or enter so that it takes. And when I play back, it's going to be slightly slower, and you'll notice that you see the steppings, the steps of the bear walking in towards the left hand side of the screen. And because I have the loop option selected, then the loop is going to keep on playing that animation until I stop it. You can stop it by pressing the space bar, by the way, if you want to. You can hit play to actually hit the when you don't have this animation. Sorry, enter is the keyboard shortcut. I said space bar is the enter key. So if I have the loop deactivated and I play the enter key, it's going to play, but it's only going to play once. So if I keep on playing, it's going to keep on playing. If I keep on hitting enter, it's going to keep on playing. If I want to see the loop, activate the loop button, hit enter or return, and it's going to keep on playing. If I want to stop it, hit the enter or return key, and the playback hit stops again. Okay, so that is one option on how to create, on how to import things. Another option is to import items to retrace within the program. So if, like we've been talking about, is we have the ability to create, do a lot of pre-production work in programs like Illustrator or Photoshop. By the way, importing items from Illustrator is the exact same way as importing them from Photoshop. The only difference is that when you import items from Illustrator, the items do not show inside your library. And that's because they come in as objects. So from the previous class, remember, you can draw objects by clicking on the item that you want to draw, go into properties, make sure that your object drawing mode is activated, right? And so once you have that activated, if you click and drag, you now have that object. Oh, sorry. Again, I keep on making the same mistake. I deactivated instead of activating it. So let me go ahead and click it. Now that it's activated, I click and drag, and you'll notice that now I have that little blue outline. If I select my bear, I also have an outline. So those are objects that I have created as objects. When you import something from Illustrator, it will come in as an object as well, which means that you would have to either break it apart, which is to separate the fill from the outline if you want to make it a shape inside Animate. But most likely it is that you're creating something in Illustrator that you want to bring in as an object, because you want to have the flexibility of working in Illustrator to bring that object in from that program and not having to redo a lot of drawing inside Animate CC. A lot of you are probably pros at working in Illustrator, so you would prefer to work in Illustrator. Some of you are really good in Photoshop, so you might want to work in Photoshop. So what happens when you work in Photoshop, say for example, and you bring in something? Well, it's, as you probably saw, this is created as an object and it comes into the library. However, whenever I draw an object that is vector-based in Animate CC, it doesn't show in the library unless I make it what we call a symbol, and we'll talk about that in our next lecture. But if I bring in something vector-based from Illustrator, it will also not be shown in the library because it comes in native as an object inside Animate. So let me go ahead and delete that circle really quick. Let me create a new layer, or actually grab that layer 3 and put it up at the top and turn off the visibility of my bear layer. And I'm going to bring in that other file from Photoshop. So let's go ahead and import to stage. And I'm going to bring in the cartoon plane. And that is, as you can see, it's a JPEG file. So let's go ahead and import that JPEG file. And it's a pretty big file of a lady flying a little airplane. Now you can see it's very basic. It's got very basic shapes and very well-defined colors. This is a JPEG, and you'll notice that it was brought into my library as a JPEG. I can actually right-click and see its properties here. So I can go ahead and affect the way this object is treated once it's inside Animate. So I can, for example, change the quality by choosing the compression settings. I can change the actual artwork. So if I click on import, it will allow me to go back and replace the artwork with something new if you want to. You also have something called allow smoothing. Allow smoothing should be activated if you are scaling the size of the object. If you're not scaling your visual, then you should not activate allow smoothing. By default, it is on, and it really doesn't take a lot of CPU power, to be honest with you. But if you don't need it, why have it? I'll keep it on just because it's default. It really doesn't affect what we're about to do. I'll click OK on this for now, just to keep it as is. And so you'll notice that basically we have the drawing. I am moving it around so I can place it somewhere center on the stage. And let me go ahead and center my stage really quick. And I'm going to reduce the visible area of my stage so that I see the entirety of what I'm working with. So what I want to do right now is with this object that I brought in selected, you'll notice under properties that it is a bitmap. It is treated as a bitmap. What that means for you is that whatever you're bringing it as a picture, as a JPEG or a PNG or a GIF, will be treated as a bitmap. What that gives you is the ability to, if let's say, for example, I wanted to affect this and I didn't want to have to go back to Photoshop to draw on it or to change the quality of it or whatnot, then my best option would be to turn it into a shape or into an object that I can manipulate inside Animate. And to do so, I would want to retrace this. Retracing here works the exact same way as retracing in Illustrator. It's a little bit more basic because in Illustrator you have a lot more control over the retracing, but over here you get pretty good quality results with the default. So two options on how to do this. You select the object, the image, the bitmap that you want to retrace, and you go into Modify, Bitmap, Trace Bitmap. That's option 1. Modify, Bitmap, Trace Bitmap. Option 2 is with the object selected, with the bitmap selected under the Properties window, you can click on Trace. And so doing that allows you to open up this window that tells you, okay, what is the color threshold that you want to play with? I'm going to keep everything as default for now. And I'll make changes to check the preview settings. So I'm going to go ahead and say, I want this, and I want to see what it looks like when I retrace it. Preview, and there it is. It looks pretty clean. It maintained most of the items that I needed to work with. So if I wanted to say that that's what I want, then I would click OK. But say, for example, I want to see this with normal, and I want to see the color threshold at 50, and I want to see a minimum area of 4. So basically, I made everything half. Preview. You'll notice that it's a little bit blurrier around, but you get more detail. You get the nose, so you're adding a little bit more colors. You get this shape of this camera here that we didn't have before. You get the little lines in front of the propeller. So those are things that we didn't have before. Let's go back to a few corners. Let's make this 8 again. Let's make this 100. And let's make, instead of this being tight, let's make it smooth and preview. And you'll notice that we lost the camera that we had here. We no longer have the nose. We don't have the little dotted lines inside the propeller. So basically, you get to play with these settings before you commit to what you want or what you're going to be working with. As you are, working with it, you can keep on previewing the end result before you commit to what you want until you get it to a point where you are happy with it. So I am going to go again to tight, few corners, 8, 100. I'm going to click preview, and that is good for me. This is the default, by the way. So let me go ahead and click OK. Now, that used to be a JPEG image that we brought in, and it was recognized as a bitmap. But if you notice now under the properties, it no longer says bitmap. It says shape, which means this is almost like if I drew it inside Animate. So what that means is all of these items are fills. That is what this is recognizing this drawing as. You see the little pattern on top of it? That means the whole thing is selected. So if I click on the gray area here on the pasteboard, everything gets deselected, and you'll notice that I see the artwork still there. But if I click on the white area around my flyer, I see that I selected that fill only. So if I select that and I move it, I can break it apart. I can delete it if I want to, so that I only have the plane and the flyer. So let me drag a selection across the entire artwork that is left, and I'm gonna use my transform tool to transform my object. Sorry, this one here. I'm gonna use the transform tool here, and I'm gonna press shift as I'm dragging so that I maintain proportions. Remember, always press shift to maintain proportions, and let me go ahead and center and make my visibility 100% so that I can see what I have created. Now, let's say, for example, let me undo that really quick so that I make it slightly bigger. I have this little thing here that I don't like. Okay, so let me go ahead and press the control spacebar or command spacebar on the keyboard, spacebar, control, spacebar command, and click selection around that area. I want to get rid of these little shapes here. I don't like those shapes. So this is where working with fills works well based on what we saw in the previous lecture. So if I want to go ahead and select with the direct selection tool, I can click on that, each one of those shapes. And as you can see, I am making a hole basically on that area in the red area of the airplane because I'm selecting those colors and I'm deleting them. But now I have a hole inside that. So if I were to place something behind it, I would see right through it. Let me go ahead and click a new layer to create it, bring it underneath layer 3, lock my layer 3 so that I don't make any changes to my plane. And inside layer 6 here, which is active, I am going to draw an object. And you'll notice that I see right through my cutout, basically. Now, that's not what I want. So let me select the layer 6, delete it. I just wanted to show you that you could see through. Now, what do I want to do then to fill this out? Well, remember, let me unlock that layer first. Oops. Let me unlock that layer first. And now that I have it unlocked, let's go ahead and use my bucket tool. So I can use the paint bucket tool. Before I do that, I'll go to paint bucket and I want to pick the color that I want to fill those areas with, which is this red right here. And then with the bucket tool, I can go ahead and click on the empty areas and fill them out with a color that matches that outline. Now you'll notice that there is something around here that had like a camera color that is a little darker. I'll click on that and same thing on this side. Boom. Now that whole area is one single shape. If I click on it, you'll notice that it gets selected. You will also notice that based on the retracing and because this is not a high resolution image, you'll get some little objects on the sides, like down here. You see those? They might not affect the size of your file, but sometimes they look a little clunky. So that's why it is best to draw things either in Illustrator or inside Animate in order to avoid the little details like that. But I understand that some of you are not savvy on either one of the two programs. So you might want to start by retracing items. Let me go ahead and go back to 100%, center. And now this now becomes a set of shapes inside Adobe Animate CC. So now with this items done, with this retrace done, what I can do now is if I don't want to by accident separate items like so, okay, if I want to make sure that everything is into one single object, I can just go ahead and drag a selection across the entirety of the artwork that I created, and I can go ahead and go to I can go ahead and go into modify, and I can make the shape, I can group it, sorry, is what I want. So I want to go modify, and I can group. So I can do that, or as you saw, there's a shortcut, which is Control G or Command G. So if I drag a selection across this, and I go Control G, then it becomes an object, and I can go ahead and move the entire thing. I am not by accident only selecting one item or one piece of the item and modifying it. So I can work with that now. Now you'll notice that even making it a control group, it still didn't make it an object. It's still a group, but it behaves almost like an object. Now, if I wanted to modify this and actually activate it, treat it as an object, then I would have to do a couple of other things to modify it in order to have access to those things. One thing that is important is even after we retrace this item, if we go back to the library, you'll notice that I still have the cartoon JPEG. The reference file is still in the library, but I don't have what I had created as an object into the library. It's still not there, and the reason for that is because we haven't turned it into what I was talking about a second ago, which is a symbol, a way to control this. That is something that we're going to be doing in our next movie. So keep in mind that you have the ability to bring in items. You can create items in Photoshop or Illustrator, and you can bring them in, and you can either choose to maintain them as they are, or you can modify them. There's a lot of flexibility on the pre-production work that you can do in these programs that saves you a lot of time when you're manipulating items within Adobe Animate CC. So take advantage of those tools that you know. Take advantage of the workflows that you've created for yourselves in programs like Photoshop or Illustrator in order to make sure that that pre-production pays off when you bring your items into Animate.